Dr. Shashi Tharoor is an iconic figure, one among a few Indian intellectuals known, recognized, and honored globally. A multifaceted person, he is no doubt one of the most gifted orators of our time. I was told by Ravi Deecee that he is as eloquent in two more languages, that is French and Bengali, as he is in English. A prolific writer, both fiction and non-fiction, centered on India and its history, its politics, commerce, diplomacy. He is adored by millions and followed by millions. No wonder 5 million people Googled to find the meaning of a phrase he used recently. Your Excellency, we are grateful to you for your gracious presence here. As you know, Dr. Shashi Tharoor is here on a private visit on our invitation for just a day. Actually, he is flying to Boston tonight for another talk there. After one day, he will be returning to Trivandrum. And having known about his visit, His Excellency Shaikh Khalifa bin Daij Al Khalifa has extended state protocol to him and has hosted a lunch in his honor today. And we are indeed thankful to you, sir, because I know India, especially Kerala, is always in your heart. Thank you for your presence. Friends, as mentioned here, our club, that is Bahrain Keraleeya, was founded in the year 1947, the year in which the modern India was born. So we have planned a year-long celebrations to commemorate the 70th birth anniversary of our mother country as well as Bahrain Keraleeya. One of the events which we have undertaken this year is a series of talks by people of eminence from India on various topics related to India. And the first of that talk will be done by Dr. Shashi Tharoor today. And Dr. Vandana Shiva's talks tomorrow will be the second in that series. Ladies and gentlemen, I am very happy to see a wonderful crowd here. We are grateful to all the VIPs, dignitaries, office bearers of various associations, and members of Bahrain Keraleeya for your presence. A word of appreciation to Mr. Ravi Deecee. Actually, he is the man behind organizing this 10-day book festival. Actually, Deecee Books was started by his father, Deecee Kidakkamari, a veteran freedom fighter and a writer and a speaker. Now Deecee Books is taken over by Mr. Ravi Deecee, a management graduate from the United States. And today, this is one of the largest publishing houses in India. And thank you, Ravi, for accepting an invitation and coming here. Once again, my greetings to each and everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. V Radhakrishnan. Now, to officially open tonight's function, I request the President of the Executive Committee members on stage to kindly escort our dignitaries for the lighting of the traditional lamp.
Dr. Shashi Tharoor is an iconic figure, one among a few Indian intellectuals known, recognized, and honored globally. A multifaceted person, he is no doubt one of the most gifted orators of our time. I was told by Ravi Deecee that he is as eloquent in two more languages, that is French and Bengali, as he is in English. A prolific writer, both fiction and non-fiction, centered on India and its history, its politics, commerce, diplomacy. He is adored by millions and followed by millions. No wonder 5 million people Google to find the meaning of a phrase he used recently. Your Excellency, we are grateful to you for your gracious presence here. As you know, Dr. Shashi Tharoor is here on a private visit on our invitation for just a day. Actually, he is flying to Boston tonight for another talk there. After one day, he will be returning to Trivandrum. And having known about his visit, His Excellency Sheikh Khalifa bin Daij Al Khalifa has extended state protocol to him and has hosted a lunch in his honor today. And we are indeed thankful to you, sir, because I know India, especially Kerala, is always in your heart. Thank you for your presence. Friends, as mentioned here, our club, that is Bahrain Keraleeya was founded in the year 1947, the year in which the modern India was born. So we have planned an year-long celebrations to commemorate the 70th birth anniversary of our mother country as well as Bahrain Keraleeya. One of the events which we have undertaken this year is a series of talks by people of eminence from India on various topics related to India. And the first of that talk will be done by Dr. Shashi Tharoor today. And Dr. Vandana Shiva's talks tomorrow will be the second in that series. Ladies and gentlemen, I am very happy to see a wonderful crowd here. We are grateful to all the VIPs, dignitaries, office bearers of various associations, and members of Bahrain Keraleeya for your presence. A word of appreciation to Mr. Ravi Deecee. Actually, he is the man behind organizing this 10-day book festival. Actually, Deecee Books was started by his father, Deecee Kirakamari, a veteran freedom fighter and a writer and a speaker. Now Deecee Books is taken over by Mr. Ravi Deecee, a management graduate from the United States. And today, this is one of the largest publishing houses in India. And thank you, Ravi, for accepting an invitation and coming here. Once again, my greetings to each and everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. V Radhakrishnan. Now, to officially open tonight's function, I request the President of the Executive Committee members on stage to kindly escort our dignitaries for the lighting of the traditional lamp. May I also invite the Executive Committee members of the Bahrain Keraleeya Samajam onto the stage. Church, Reverend Joshua Abraham to please come on stage to receive his book. I request Mr. M.T. Matthews, the CEO of Almoid Contracting, to please come on stage. May I call upon also Dr. K.G. Baburaj, MD of QEL, to come on stage, please. Mr. K.G. Baburaj. Mr. V.K. Rajashekara Pillai, I request him to please come on stage. Dr. Menon, I request Dr. Menon to please come on stage. Mr. Amblikutan, somebody to represent. Mr. Varghese Karakal of the Trishur fraternity to please come on stage. Can we? Mr. Prince Natarajan, the chairman of the Indian School Bahrain, to please come on stage. Dr. V. Gopalan, director of the New Indian School, please come on stage. Mr. Masood, director of Al Noor International School, you'll do us the honors of coming up on stage to collect your book. Mrs. Molly Mammon, principal of the Asian School, please come on stage. Mr. Arun Kumar Sharma, the principal of the DPS, to please come up on stage to receive your book, sir. Mr. Himanshu Verma, director of the Bahrain Indian School. Okay. Dr. M.C. John of the Indian Club. Mr. Pambavasan Nair, president of the NSS. Mr. Chandra Bose of the GSS. Mr. Ajit of the Kannur Association. Sharif and Mahesh of Pradibha. Mr. Raghu and Mr. Suresh Babu of Jwala Bahrain. Mr. Rafiq Abdullah of Index Bahrain. Mrs. Lakshmi Priya of KCP. Mr. Sachin Verghese. Mr. Nahas Omar. Mr. Ajit Dadabai, CEO of Dadabai Constructions. Mrs. Fatima Kamis. Mr. Anthony of One Pavilion. Mr. Abu Bakar. Mr. Francis Kaidarat. Ms. Prasanna. Advocate V.K. Thomas. Mr. Madhu of Moore Stephen. Mrs. Mohini Thomas, President Vanita Samajam. Ms. Pradeepa Singh, CEO SBI. Mr. Vinesh Kumar, UAE Exchange. Mr. Harish, KPMG Fakru. Mr. Suresh Nair. Mr. Jamal Nadvi of the French Social Association. Mr. Vian and Shine. Mr. Anthony Paulos. Mr. Rajiv Lakshman. Mr. Ramesh Ramachandran. I request the names that were called out to please come on stage and collect your book that has been autographed by Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Mr. Sachin also tonight has donated BD 100 to the BKS library. I'd like to announce that too. As we finish this, may I now call upon His Excellency Sheikh Khalifa bin Daij Al Khalifa to kindly address the audience tonight.
Good evening. Your Excellency, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It brings me great honor to welcome such a great character, such a personality here in Bahrain and here in this club. But no matter how hard I try to welcome this distinguished guest, I think a whole full of people who are here to greet him and see him, says such great words. So thank you very much for coming here. This really shows the commitment you have, and this really shows the love you have for this international personality. I met Dr. Shashi Tharoor on several occasions. The first was in Davos, and this, I believe, was in 2008 or 2009. I also met Dr. Shashi Tharoor in Kerala during my last visit to the Bahrain Returnees Association, where I was honored. And Dr. Shashi Tharoor sat with me on stage and welcomed me there. So this is only appropriate that I come here myself and welcome him as he did welcoming me. I won't take much longer, but I am really looking forward to reading the book which Dr. Shashi is inaugurating today, An Era of Darkness. And I believe it's a historical document in which we have heard and have seen and learned throughout the years. But I think this is a document where it will enlighten us and really shed some light on some of the historical facts. So, Dr. Shashi, I'm really looking forward to reading it and then having possibly a discussion around it. Thank you. I wish you all a good evening, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for your gracious words. I now call upon Mr. Ravi Deecee, the managing partner of Deecee Books, one of the 5 literary book publishers in India, to address the audience.
His Excellency Shaikh Khalifa bin Daij Al Khalifa, President of the Council of Crown Prince, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Radhakrishnan, V Radhakrishnan, Anand Prakash from the Indian Embassy, and dear ladies and gentlemen. It's a great privilege to be here. This is the 4th DC International Book Fair, which is happening with the Bahrain Keraleeya Samajam. I'm really proud that it's continuing, and it's actually it's happening in a rather better vigor. And this year we have a literature festival which we never had before, like something like this. And one of the things is actually, we also wanted Shashi Tharoor to be here as a part of the program, and glad that Shashi could come and do the inauguration of the BKS DC International Book Fair. I've known Dr. Shashi Tharoor from the 1990s when he was Deputy Undersecretary of the UN, Undersecretary General of United Nations, and that's the time I've read his India Midnight to Millennium, and I really got obsessed with the book, and that's how I first wrote to him, and ever since he has been a well-wisher of DC Books and a great friend of mine. And I'm sure you are all waiting for Shashi's speech, so I'm not going to elaborate further, but believe me, this is one of the books you must read as an Indian, because he has set the perspectives right as far as colonialism, what British has done to India, and I'm really happy that we are able to do the Malayalam translation of the book. We have done all the books of Shashi in Malayalam, and Shashi is one of the, Dr. Shashi Tharoor is one of the best-selling authors in Malayalam, and I've seen him speak in a couple of other languages, as Radhakrishnan said earlier. I've heard him actually at the Paris Book Fair, I've heard him at the Frankfurt Book Fair, and in many places Shashi is a crowd puller. Shashi is a big crowd puller, and I'm sure today you are all going to enjoy Shashi's conversation and the Q&A session, and thank you all for being here, and thank you, Shashi, for coming all the way, in fact, for the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Deecee. I'm just going to say 2 sentences before inviting our guest. We've read about him and known about him so much. I'm just going to take one of his most famous tweets and say that he's at least increased 5 words in the vocabulary of a lot of people. And from his own tweet, the person who has contributed Farrago to the national conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Dr. Shashi Tharoor.
Thank you very much. And indeed, seeing you all here is immensely gratifying. I'm sorry that so many of you had to stand, but I hope we can keep you engaged for the evening. Your Excellency Khalid bin Daij bin Khalifa, the President of the Bahrain Keraleeya Samajam, Mr. V Radhakrishnan, Mr. Veeramani Secretary, my good friend Ravi Deecee, my publisher in Malayalam, Mr. Prakash of the Indian Embassy, other distinguished office holders of the BKS on stage, very distinguished members of the audience, ladies and gentlemen, or as we say in Malayalam, Sahodari Sahodaramare, ellarkkum ente vinidamaya namaskaram. It really is wonderful to be here on the occasion of this first BKS DC Literary Festival and to inaugurate it on this occasion. In fact, I was struck by the fact that BKS is also a very common short form for books. So BKS DC is like Books DC, and I think it works very well for a literary festival name. Equally, books and the reading habit are indispensable to those of us who write, because there would be no writers if there were no readers. Writers write to be read, and it's a matter of great satisfaction when Ravi tells me that here in Bahrain, people are lapping up books despite their much higher price as a result of the transportation costs from India. So the fact that you are all reading is also a matter of great pride for us. I'm very touched by the presence here of Shaikh Khalifa. I had the pleasure, as he mentioned, of meeting him a couple of times, most recently when he was honored in Thiruvananthapuram by the people of the constituency, of my constituency, and particularly by the Bahrain Trivandrum returnees. And what was striking was his graciousness, his openness and receptivity to the occasion and to the people of Thiruvananthapuram. And today again, while I was apologizing for some of our more time-consuming activities, he was totally unbothered. He said, no, these are all familiar people to me. I think he sounds like a politician who would win a lot of votes if he contested from here, from all of you. If the Kerala voters could elect him, I'm sure that he would do very well. I also want to thank Ravi Deecee for having brought the book here. I don't know how many of you know this, but the Malayalam edition has not yet been released in Kerala. So what you've seen is actually the actual release of the Malayalam edition. The book An Era of Darkness was published a few months ago in English. It's now appeared in the UK as well, where, to my pleasant surprise, it has climbed to the #1 rank in the bestseller charts of the London Evening Standard. So the Brits are also reading it. But of course in India it has had a certain impact, and it was already mentioned to you. The particular factor that led to this was when I was invited to address an Oxford Union debate and made a speech on the inequities and depredations of British colonialism in India, which a couple of months later was loaded on YouTube by the Oxford Union organizers and then went viral. And since millions of people were watching it, my publisher called me and said, you have to turn this into a book. And I said, for God's sake, why bother? Everyone knows this already in India. And he said, no, they don't, because if they did know it already, your speech wouldn't have gone viral. So that convinced me that perhaps indeed there was a need to put together these arguments in one place once again for a modern generation. And that's what I've done. I have described in An Era of Darkness how the British came to what was the richest country in the world in 1700. In 1700, India accounted for 27% of global GDP. For comparison, today the United States is about 23% of global GDP. So India accounted for 27% of global GDP. the revenues of the Indian Emperor Aurangzeb in 1700 were more than those of all the crowned heads of Europe put together. So that includes King Louis and his palace in Versailles. It includes the Queen in Buckingham Palace, the whole lot of them. Their revenues collectively did not match what the Mughal Emperor could count upon. So that was the richness of India. And in the course of 250 years of British presence, 200 years of British rule, they managed to drain the resources of this rich country, and through a series of disastrous policies and deliberate loot, they reduced it to one of the poorest, most diseased, most illiterate countries in the world. The British left India in 1947 with a poverty line that accounted for 90% of the population were below the poverty line. The average life expectancy was 27. That is, the average person born in India could not expect to live beyond 27. The literacy rate was 17%. It was even worse for women because women were 8.9% literacy. And of course, infant mortality, child mortality, or landlessness, all sorts of things were widespread across the country, thanks to 200 years of British rule. 35 million people had lost their lives in famines created deliberately by British imperial policy. So when you look at all of this, you ask yourself, how is it that people today are so unaware of all that has happened? I often say to young people, why should you know about the past? Because if you don't know where you've come from, how will you appreciate where you're going? I'm not interested in focusing on history by dwelling in the past, particularly as a politician and a public figure. My interest is in the present and in the future of my country. And in India, in any case, we've had a long tradition of forgiveness. There is a story I recount in the book about Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of independent India, being received by Winston Churchill in the mid-50s, and Churchill says to him, how is it that despite the fact that we forced you to spend 10 years of your life in jail, that you bear us no bitterness, no rancor? And Nehru is said to have replied, I was taught by a great man, Mahatma Gandhi, never to fear and never to hate. That is a fine virtue, because I think all of us who have read anything of Indian spiritual wisdom will confirm that hatred is a negative emotion, that forgiveness is good because the hater often hurts himself more than the object of his hatred. That negativity eats you up. So you should forgive. But the philosophy of forgive and forget, to me, has a problem. I want the people of India to forgive, but I do not want us to forget. I believe it is important for us to have a consciousness of what went on for 200 years, both to understand it for its own sake and to understand where we are, why we are where we are today. If today we have 26% poverty, we can certainly criticize Indian governments. But if you realize that we have come from 90% poverty, you might actually believe that some good has been accomplished. If today we are 69 as our life expectancy, you may say that is not good enough. China is 78. But if you realize we came from 27, perhaps you won't feel that it is so wrong. If you realize that our literacy rate is 72, that our women are 66.5, you may say, what a pity. Clearly, there's so much that our governments have not done to educate our people. But if you realize the numbers were 17 and 8.9, perhaps you may be a little more understanding. The challenge of India's development has been built on the ruins of what the British Empire did in India. Let's not forget that. But let us also remember our past glory in order to aspire to recreate that glory. Frankly, I don't think we're going to ever be in the imaginable future at 27% of the global's GDP. Again, that won't happen because the world has become more prosperous. Every country has grown into prosperity. But we can certainly rise above our present situation. We can certainly pull the remainder of our people out of poverty. And that is a challenge that I think gets intensified when you read about the past and understand where we've come from. Now, what exactly is the broad theme of the book? I'm hoping, of course, that you will read it, particularly those of you who have received copies today, and I believe there are more copies available outside at the back of the room. But the broad story is very simple. The British came in, they destroyed the existing industries of India. They destroyed a sophisticated society, a wealthy society of artisans, merchants, traders, warriors, and replaced it with their own rule. The country which was the leading exporter of textiles in the world was forced to become an importer of British textiles. Indeed, the Indian textiles were so good, were of such high quality, that there is material available in the literature of anecdotes of British shopkeepers in the 17th and 18th century trying to pass off shoddy European-made textiles as made in India, because made in India was a hallmark of quality and fetched a higher price. But the British came in unable to compete with these wonderful cottons, linens, muslins. Muslin so fine, it was said, it was fine, it was light as woven air. It was said that some of the Dhaka gauzes could be pulled through a ring. That's how fine they were. And what did the British do? They came in, they destroyed the looms of the weavers. They depopulated the great weaving towns of Dhaka and Murshidabad, whose populations actually dropped in the first years of British rule because they were attacking the looms and the weavers, destroying the industry. In one notorious incident, they cut off the thumbs of the weavers so they could not weave again. And since they controlled the ports, they imposed heavy duties and tariffs on India's exports, thereby destroying India's export markets, while reducing or eliminating duties and tariffs on their imports, thereby ensuring for themselves a captive market in India. A second example is shipbuilding. We were the leading country in the world in shipbuilding. The shipbuilders of Bengal, of Visakhapatnam and the Godavari Delta, and of the West Coast were of very, very high quality. In fact, our teak and mahogany woods were so durable and the craftsmanship was so high that our ships would last easily 25, 26 years on the high seas, whereas the average European ship, usually made of fir or pine, could only last 6 or 7 years. So when the British established themselves in India, they said, this is wonderful, let's make our ships in India. And the quality was so good, there were lots of writings admiring the quality of these Indian ships. But the result was that it started throwing people out of work in London. In the dockyards of London, shipwrights and craftsmen and fitters and so on became out of work. And so the British Parliament passed a law that made it impossible for ships made in India from plying on the lucrative international routes, particularly to London itself. And the result was, of course, the death of Indian shipping. Third example, steel. India had invented the finest steel in the world. It was called wrongly by the Europeans wood steel, W-O-T-Z, which looks as if it's a Polish or Czech word. But in fact, it was a corruption of the Kannada word ukka. It was called ukka steel, which was invented in what is today Karnataka. And this steel was of such high quality, the Arabs came and borrowed the technology to make their famous Damascus steel. And when the British came to India and engaged in their first battles, whenever they killed Indian soldiers, they would dismount from their horses and steal their swords, because the Indian soldiers' swords were made of such much better quality steel than anything available in Europe. That industry too was destroyed by the British, who imposed a British monopoly and imposed British standard steel specifications on the Indian market. So these are the kinds of examples of deindustrialization that I describe in more detail in the book, and what is more, the replacement of them by British goods. The second was the drainage of Indian resources. The British came quite directly to steal. They were in it for the money. They took the word, the Hindi word, loot, into their dictionaries as well as their habits. And they proceeded to pillage the treasuries of all the principalities they conquered, even while marveling at their own self-restraint in not stealing more. Robert Clive wrote about how he could help himself to all the jewels, all the gold in every treasure chest, and that he could have actually stolen more. He was actually asking for praise that, having become one of the richest men in Europe by his theft in India, that he hadn't become even richer still. He bought a rotten borough for himself, became a member of parliament, and the British had the gall to call him Clive of India, as if he belonged to the country, when all he really had done was to ensure that much of the country's wealth belonged to him. Now, this was the kind of thing that went on. There was very severe taxation. Yes, we had our periods of bad taxation also, but for the most part, Indian taxation was much more reasonable, much less onerous than the British. Indian taxes were imposed with some humanity. So if the peasant had a death in the family, or there was a drought that year, or there was a daughter getting married, the tendency was to waive the tax or postpone the tax or reduce the tax. That humanity was completely absent in the British. When they took over, they exacted very high taxes, a minimum of 45% of the crop, sometimes going as much as 95% of the crop. And if people wouldn't pay, they were flogged, they were tortured, they were humiliated in public places in order to get them to pay. And all the proceeds of the taxes, at least the old Maharajas, would spend the bulk of the taxes in the country, building bridges and roads and culverts and serais and so on. The British would ship all the money off to England. And so it was not only an exaction of tax, it was the drainage of resources to England that was so iniquitous. Year after year after year, amounting to billions of pounds sterling taken away from India throughout the time of British rule. On top of that, their economic mismanagement of India was such that the growth rate of the Indian economy in the entire first half of the 20th century until 1947 was less than 0.01%. At the same time, the British got India to finance their work in the First World War. Not only the soldiers we sent, over 1 million Indians fought under arms, 1.3 million fought under arms for the British in the First World War, and 77,000 died for the British. But also, we sent food, we sent cash, we sent arms, we sent ammunition, we sent vehicles and carts, we sent pack animals. Even rail lines were ripped out of the ground and shipped off to aid the war effort. And the result is that in today's money, the Indian contribution to the British war effort was in the neighborhood of 800 billion pounds sterling. And this in a country that, thanks to British rule, was not growing economically. In fact, during the war, there was terrible inflation in India. We had the world's highest toll because of the worldwide influenza epidemic. 125 million Indians were infected. Terrible time. And yet we sent all these resources. That was the story. Now, obviously, there's much more detail in the book. I'm just giving you some examples for you to understand on the economic side. The creation of landlessness. We had so many travelers from the Arab world, from the Ottoman Empire, and from Europe coming to India in the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries writing about it. No one describes poverty. No one describes landlessness. They constantly describe this amazingly rich country, full of prosperous people. You can't get so many different writers and travelers from so many different parts of the world at so many different periods to tell you the same quote-unquote PR. So clearly this was the truth. The British came in thanks to their policies of permanent settlement of land, their introduction of a zamindari system, their introduction, their replication of a kind of squirearchy, rather like they had in England. In India, they created landlessness. They deprived the poor farmer of his own land, reduced him to a tenant, and transformed, therefore, the nature of rural poverty in our country. There's a lot more that can be said, but let me turn the argument around for a minute. Some people say maybe all this is true. Oh wait, I did want to tell you a little more about famines before. I'll come back to this in a minute. Famines. I didn't see too many expressions of surprise when I said earlier that 35 million people died in famines for which I blamed the British. And some of you might have thought, why blame the British? A famine is an act of God. It is not. Droughts may be an act of God, but historically they were responses to droughts. They were welfare measures and charity carried out by the Maharajas, by the rich people of every village, every neighborhood. Nobody was allowed to starve to death. The British, however, came to India with three policy principles with regard to famines. First was the Adam Smith principle of the free market. You cannot interfere with the free market. If people can't afford to buy the grain, that because we are buying it and shipping it off to England, tough, let them die. Second principle, the Malthusian principle. Many of the students here will know the population theories of Malthus. Malthusian principle was that if the land cannot sustain the population that is trying to live off it, people must die so the natural population balance can be reasserted. And the third theory is very simple. Victorian fiscal prudence. Thou shalt not spend money thou hast not budgeted for. So with these three principles, the British refused to help during droughts. They did the same thing in Ireland, by the way, which is why in the 1840s, the Great Potato Blight, so many Irishmen died and so many got onto boats and migrated to America. That's why there are so many Irish people in America, because of British famine policy. But in India, we didn't have that option. We couldn't get on a boat and go to America, so we just died here. And the British were utterly heartless in their policies. They would refuse to allow aid to be given. I've recounted an anecdote from the Orissa famine of 1866, when a gentleman with the Irish-sounding name of Mr. McMinn was trying to help a poor person starving to death. And the British told him, if you don't stop doing this, we will send you back to the United Kingdom. You can't stay in India if you want to help people who are starving. Eventually, in the later part of the 19th century, there was an outcry against these policies. So very grudgingly, the British said, no, we will not allow charity, but we will create work camps. But these work camps were so awful that the rations given to people who had to work for those rations was lower than the Nazis were to give the inmates of the Buchenwald concentration camp during the Second World War. The Jews they were about to exterminate in the gas ovens. So that's the kind of horrible behavior. And as late as the Second World War, we had the Great Bengal famine, in which 4.3 million Indians starved to death because of decisions deliberately taken by Winston Churchill. Churchill ordered that grain from Bengal should be shipped to Europe, not even just to aid the war effort, as was often said by the Brits, but to build up reserve stocks of grain in the event of a possible future invasion of Greece and Yugoslavia. And for that purpose, Indians were allowed to starve to death, because obviously the purchases of all this grain and shipping it to Europe meant that what little grain remained became unaffordably priced for the poor man. And people were literally dying on the street. When conscience-stricken British officials wrote to London saying to the Prime Minister, Churchill, that his policies were killing such large numbers of people, all Churchill could bring himself to do was to write peevishly in the margin, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" And this is the man whom the British want us to hail as an apostle of freedom and democracy. An absolute evil, racist murderer of innocent people. Now, this is when the apologists for the empire turn around and say, all right, these things happened, but think of all the good the British did. After all, they gave you the railways, they gave you the English language, they gave you rule of law, and so on. So what I've done in the second half of my book is I've taken each of these things, including the biggest claim of all, that Britain gave India political unity, and I have systematically demolished each of them by showing that every single thing they brought in, including tea and cricket, were brought in for their benefit to either enhance British profits or to facilitate British control over India. And I don't know how much time we have, but I should go into each of those stories, because the idea was also to have a question and answer exchange with you all, so that if some of you want to ask about these things in greater detail, we're happy to answer. But I'll just address a couple of them. Let's take the railways, because that's such a common example. Everyone says, shouldn't we be grateful to the British for the railways? Let me tell you, the railways were a great British colonial scam. They were brought into India for the principal purpose of extracting resources from the Indian heartland that were otherwise inaccessible by normal transport, and taking them to the ports to ship them to England. And the secondary purpose was to send troops into the restive interior of the country to put down any unrest. Those were the two purposes the British officially stated in order to justify the expenditure on the railways. Second, as usual with the British, they made a huge profit on the backs of the Indian taxpayer while building their railways. Investment in the Indian railways became the single most profitable investment any Englishman could make in the London Stock Exchange, with double the returns guaranteed of even government stocks and shares, bonds. So that the Indian taxpayer paid and the British investor profited. So much so there was no control on expenditure. They spent a fortune while building the railway, and each mile of railway in India cost 9 times the same mile in the US or Canada, which they were being built at the same time. Not only that, the railways were run in a very racist manner, in which they actually managed to ensure that pretty much every key position except the most menial, from station masters to ticket collectors, were Englishmen, right up to the First World War. And what they did was that even when Indians were eventually hired, they were paid lower wages than the white people. It really was only with independence that we were able to turn the purpose of the railways. Under the British, when these third-class railway carriages with their wooden slat benches were added for Indians to travel, the Indians paid the highest passenger rates in the world, whereas the British companies using the railways for freight paid the lowest freight rates in the world. It's only after independence we've gone to the other extreme, the opposite extreme, and we have given our passengers, our people, the lowest passenger rates in the world, and added routes catering to the demand for travel of Indian people, while raising the freight rates so high that now unfortunately it's become a bit uneconomical to ship freight on the railways, and our businesses are busy putting more and more lorries onto the congested highways of our country, thereby worsening our environment. So I hope we can find some sort of balance in our policy. But that shows you how much the policy was designed only to serve the British. when it comes to political unity, I point out that well before the British, Indians had manifested a yearning for political unity in India's own history. Going back to Chandragupta Maurya and Ashoka, 3 centuries before the birth of Christ, who united most of the subcontinent as one country in one empire, to the Mughals, who did the same thing 1700 years later, and created a united India as well. So the British were merely doing what other rulers of India who were powerful enough were able to do. Because indeed the idea of Indian civilization was always of one land. The Bharat Varsh of the Rig Veda, this land between the Himalayas and the seas, was a common vision shared by everyone. Adi Shankara from Kerala, Shankaracharya, traveling the length and breadth of India and establishing his mutts in the south, in Kanchi, up in the north, in Srinagar, Kashmir, in Dwarka in the west, in the Jagannath and Puri in the east. All of those reflected an India of what the Harvard scholar Diana Eck calls the sacred geography of the country, knit together by countless tracts of pilgrimage. And if you think that's a purely Hindu idea, think again, because Maulana Abul Kalam Azad has written about the idea of India as one place being shared by Muslims from other countries. So whenever an Indian went on the Hajj, whether he was a Pathan from the northwest or a Tamil from the southeast, he was described by the Arabs in the peninsula as Hindi. The assumption was there was one common people coming from Al-Hind. So that idea of one nation is not a gift of the British. But what the British did do was to destroy the political unity that Indians had yearned for over millennia by fomenting a policy of divide and rule after the mutiny, as they called it, the revolt of 1857, and consciously creating a sense of separation between Hindus and Muslims that culminated in the tragic partition of 1947. So if anything, the British can be credited with destroying India's political unity, not with creating it. And as for the rule of law, just to take a third example of their supposed benefits, I demonstrate in the book how the law was applied with excessive attention to the skin color of the defendant. So that in 200 years of British rule, you could only find 3 cases where Englishmen were convicted for murdering Indians. Whereas every year, hundreds of Indians were killed by English people, and there was no punishment or very modest punishment. In fact, one famous example is how so many Indian domestic servants were kicked to death by their British masters. But they were let off the hook on the grounds that Indians suffered from so much malaria that our spleens are enlarged, and so it wasn't the kick that killed the Indian, but the rupturing of his enlarged spleen. This is actually there in the literature. Punch magazine has even written an ode to the stout British boot, which was used to discipline the Indians. You can't speak of the rule of law in such a racist society, one in which only English judges could try Englishmen, and where the Indians who rose up the legal profession were humiliated and treated with great disrespect until the 20th century. I think I'm exhausting your patience, so I'm going to stop here, but these are all examples of what I've tried to do in the book. And at the end, I also speak a little bit about the messy afterlife of colonialism everywhere, looking to the lingering consequences here in the Arab world. It is no coincidence that ISIS Daesh, in their original pronouncements, spoke about undoing the injustice of the Sykes-Picot line, drawn by the British and the French here. Now, it so happens that the states of the region believe that whether you like the colonialists or not, it would be too destabilizing to challenge the boundaries they drew, and so we must live with these boundaries. That's also the position in Africa. And of course, it's a position for us in India. We are living with the line drawn by Mr. Radcliffe in 1947. But at the same time, let us not forget how many lingering problems, right up to and including the Palestine tragedy, can be laid at the door of careless and racist colonialism. I'm going to stop there because I would like to take some questions and comments from all of you. This is a broad summary of my book, An Era of Darkness. The British publisher actually put in an even tougher title for the British edition. In Britain, this book is called Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India. I think the title speaks for itself. I rest my case. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll have this interactive session with Dr. Shashi. I had thought that I could play it safe by bringing some questions onto the stage, but Dr. Shashi will not play it that way. He would like to take the questions directly from the audience. So I've sent a mic. I have a young assistant who will bring the mic over there, and I will give this mic to Dr. Shashi to continue.
I've been allowed to sit down, but if you stand, I can see you better. So please, go ahead. Tell me who you are, please, and so I know a little bit about who I'm speaking.
I'm Meenakshi Mathur. I'm from Delhi, and here I teach in the DPS.
Right.
I'm a history teacher teaching grade 10, 11, and 12. And whatever you spoke just now, it was like I was having my class.
Oh, I'm very pleased to hear that.
I did record a lot of things. I will share it with my students also tomorrow. My question is that I'm a big fan of Shashi Tharoor, the diplomat.
Oh.
Yes, following you for many years. And I still feel that you should have been a diplomat. You're more impressive as a diplomat than as a politician. So which role do you consider which one do you enjoy more?
Well, the question is academic because I'm already a politician, and what is worse, I've passed the retirement age for diplomats.
But you entered politics before you passed your retirement.
I did. No, listen, I had a very interesting, challenging, and rewarding United Nations career where I had a number of opportunities to do some very interesting work for refugees, Vietnamese boat people tragedy, peacekeeping, the Yugoslav civil war was with me. The work with Kofi Annan in his own office when he became Secretary General, traveling around the world, meeting world leaders, and finally running my own department at the UN. But Meenakshi, I think there is a sentiment of been there, done that. And when I left the UN, it was very much with the view that I should not look back, and I should indeed focus on the need to be relevant to one's own country and one's own people, which is what I hope to do by getting into Indian politics. Ultimately, whether I'm impressive enough or not as a politician, only the voters can decide. So far, they've allowed me 2 times to come back to Parliament. We'll have to see if that lasts yet again. But the truth is that being as effective as one can be in delivering services to one's constituents, contributing to the national conversation in Parliament, and of course using the public platforms, media, and so on to advance one's values and interests, all of that is also part of the political responsibility that I have taken of trying to advocate a set of beliefs and values and principles and an idea of India in our public space. And that I hope to continue to do, even if the voters decide to return me to the world of literature.
Thank you, sir. I'm sure the voters will give you the chance to be in
Thank you,
Parliament.
Respectable Dr. Shashi Tharoor, this is Idathodi Bhaskaran. I just heard that all the past about the British who looted India, in fact. But as a politician, apart from the political stand of you, and being a patriotic Indian, how do you value India's present stand after we got the independence from 47? And apart from the politics, I mean Congress or BJP or whatever it is, but what is your real value about India's today? Thank you.
No, I think that we've come a long way, as I was explaining in the initial part of my remarks, when I talked about the changes in the poverty line and the literacy rate and all these factors I mentioned in my speech, that very clearly a lot of progress has been made. I wish more could have been done. I do believe, for example, that while one understood why Nehruji first went for a more state-dominated system to lay an effective platform in India, created the IITs, created the basic steel industry and so on, I think we were a bit slow to liberalize. I think the Chinese started liberalizing from 1978, at which point they had the same GDP as us and therefore a lower per capita income. And by giving themselves a 15-year head start on us, you can see how far they have grown in terms of becoming a much larger economy. So I do wish that we too had seen the global currents and liberalized in the late 70s, or latest around the time of the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, when globalization as we know it really began. We came to it only in the 1990s, and of course we came to it in a way in which there was a certain amount of hesitancy as well. Nonetheless, no point lamenting missed opportunities. We have made good progress, we continue to make good progress. We are today the third largest economy in the world in PPP terms, purchasing power parity terms. That is, we've overtaken Japan. But in about 10-15 years, we may even become the third largest in nominal terms, that is in real dollar terms, not in purchasing power parity. So we are on course to become a very, very major economy. I would feel that whether we grow at 6% or 8%, what really matters is the bottom 25% of our society. Because if we can't solve their fundamental problems of existence, 3 square meals a day, a roof over their head, decent clothes to wear, the prospect of a job and work, then we will have failed, however much we may grow in absolute terms. So I think we need to ensure that every Indian is able to take for granted the kind of decent life that, let's say, every American or Australian or even most of the Gulf Arabs are able to take for granted. So there is a lot that we still need to do, but I believe we have the capacity, the resources, the talents to be able to do it.
Good evening. This has been such a great opportunity to hear you speak, and I thank you really. I'm Sashwati Bora and I work at the University of Bahrain, and I'm very glad for the Bahrain Keraleeya Samajam to have this event.
Thank you.
Yes, and your speech has brought back memories that I recall from childhood. My dad was saying almost everything that you said, actually. He actually was a student in undivided India at Dhaka University and had to leave there. And I do recall everything he said. My question is, a little apart from the topic of your book, do you think that literary awards have become too predictable nowadays? And is literature becoming formulaic? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that literature is rather like beauty. Appreciation is very subjective. And therefore, giving an award to a book by comparison with other books that happen to be published around the same time, to my mind is very much, what can I say, a luck of the draw kind of thing. It may be that a better book was published just before or just after, or it may be that a book that was capable of winning next year was published this year and lost out to somebody else. The judges may have their own tastes, their own predilections. The readers may have their own tastes. Many of the Nobel Prize winners for literature. You can go through the list. Their books have not endured, whereas many who failed to win the Nobel are still being read and admired and talked about and taught. So I think literature or literary awards, to my mind, are much less worthwhile. They're a matter of the moment. They give a writer some honors, some money, some recognition. I'm happy for the writer. But I don't think that they really speak meaningfully to the value of the work.
Good evening, Dr. Tharoor. Myself, Ajay Jaiswal. I work for a bank here in Bahrain. My question is, in today's environment of right-wing wave all around us, I find your thoughts are more of a Nehruvian philosophy they represent. And I know you have read Nehru a lot. Your thoughts, you quoted Nehru also.
I've written a biography of Nehru.
Nehru also, yeah. How long do you think this Nehruvian philosophy will continue under the current circumstances of right-wing sweeping all across the world?
Well, I think there are some principles of Nehruji that are totally timeless and will be relevant for years to come, even if they are repudiated by a particular government or by the government of the day. Eventually, they are fundamental, it seems to me, to an appreciation of what India is all about. And there are other things of Nehru's beliefs that have obviously become outdated and have evolved with time. If I were to describe the 4 pillars of Nehruvianism, I would first speak about democracy. He was a convinced Democrat who really did more to nurture India's infant democratic institutions than anybody else. And I think that deep entrenching of democracy, the sense of India that Indian people have, that this is our right, it's our government, we elect the leaders, we determine our own political destiny, that we owe to Nehru. There's no question that many, many, many countries, immediately after winning independence from the colonial masters, overthrew democracy and established authoritarian rule, including all our neighbors, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and so on, because they said that is the only way that we can keep the country together and direct and promote development. Nehru was not tempted by that argument. He could have seized untrammeled power, but instead he chose to rule as a Democrat, to give deference to democratic institutions. And I believe those practices are amongst his most important legacies. A second principle was definitely his secularism. I think that secularism is an accurate description for his own beliefs, but may not be the best word to use to describe the Indian reality. Because if you look up a dictionary, secularism refers to the absence of religion. Nehru was not a religious man, so it's entirely appropriate that he believed in secularism. What I argue for is pluralism. Pluralism rather than secularism, because the point about pluralism is that it accepts multiple religions, multiple forms of identity, all of which coexist by accepting each other and living with each other. To my mind, that pluralism is the essence of India. It's certainly a Nehruvian belief. Ultimately, the difference is one of vocabulary. There are 2 other pillars of Nehruvianism with which I think we can part company. I think Nehruvian socialism, now the idea of socialism as promoting social justice, no one can disagree with. Even this avowedly right-wing government of Mr. Modi speaks very clearly of social justice, the rights of the poor, ensuring that government policies help the poorest of the poor. So even if they don't use the word socialism, the objective is the same. But the method of giving a lot of economic power to the government, to the state, putting the state on the commanding heights of the economy rather than business people, having the state run everything from airlines to hotels to industries, consumer goods, all this sort of stuff, that I think is an approach that has outlived its utility. Maybe in the initial years of India's independence it was necessary because we didn't have enough capitalists with the resources to do some of these things. Today that is no longer true. And I would say that the government should get out of those things that the private sector does better, whether it's running airlines or running hotels. I don't think the government should be in that. And I think in many ways Nehru was such an intelligent man with such a lively mind that he would quite likely have evolved his own thinking as the world itself changed. And the final pillar of Nehruvianism is non-alignment, foreign policy non-alignment. That was about preserving India's right to make its own decisions, because for 200 years foreigners had ruled us and told us what to do and spoken in our name abroad. The League of Nations, for example, we had people like the former England cricket captain C.B. Fry heading the Indian delegation. So when that kind of thing happened, it was humiliating for us. Nehru didn't want immediately after independence for India to join an alliance where again it would have to do what the alliance decided to do. So he wanted to preserve India's freedom of action, India's strategic autonomy. And to that degree, that's very important, still will always be important. Non-alignment as a concept of equidistance between two superpowers in a Cold War may be irrelevant today, because there, first of all, is no longer any Cold War for two sort of potentially warring superpowers having a standoff and countries trying to navigate a path between them. That era is over. That binary world of the Cold War is over. So to that degree, non-alignment in the classic sense is no longer relevant. But the idea that India should not be aligned with anybody but should make its own decisions, to my mind, that will always be relevant and always be necessary, because it's the only thing that's compatible with our own self-respect.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take two more questions for tonight. There's a lady at the back.
Here.
The young lady at the back, please. Can we just have the mic to that young lady at the over there?
A question.
Yes.
There's a young lady there. Come forward.
Come forward.
Where's the mic?
Okay. Question for Dr. Tharoor. So you had brought up the topic of Sykes-Picot, the infamous line devised by George Picot and Mark Sykes from A curve to Kirchhoff. Do you think that the Middle East, which has been negatively impacted by British and French colonialism, and they had arbitrarily divided up the Ottoman Alliance, and do you think that the Middle East can learn something from India, how India has withstood something that what has happened in the Middle East, like the fragmentation of Syria, for example. So do you think India can teach the Middle East something?
Not really, because I think both India and the and the West Asian countries have taken the same approach, that once the lines are drawn, you have to live with them. So even, for example, after we conquered East Pakistan in 1971, we didn't try to absorb it into India. We let it remain as an independent country called Bangladesh. So I think that it's going to be difficult to undo these lines. Once you challenge one line of a colonial map, all other lines come in question, and every state feels insecure about its sovereignty and its control of its own territory. So no, I would say that basically we're stuck with those lines. In any case, the world is united in trying to crush ISIS, Daesh, whatever they may want to do about Sykes-Picot or not. Yes,
okay.
yeah.
This is Samajam. He will take one or two questions in Malayalam related to after this.
Let her ask.
After this, yes.
Good evening, sir. My name is Pearl Augustine, and I'm a former graduate of the Indian School, Bahrain. And currently, I have completed my master's degree in English literature. So I'm so happy to see you right in front of my eyes, because I follow Tharoor, I have read Tharoor, and it's just amazing to see you right here.
Thank you.
And sir, I have two questions. The first being, what's your stance about uneducated people playing politics? And the second being, how do you envision India another 20 years down the lane?
Well, on the first one, in a democracy, your political representatives are supposed to represent the people. So if there are people who feel comfortable being represented by uneducated people, so be it. That is literally the way it's got to have to be. And I certainly, as you know, have advocated for some time that more and more people from the segments of the educated middle class who normally go into the IAS or the IFS or become doctors and engineers and lawyers, that they should also go into politics, because if we are to represent all the people in India, that segment of society should not be unrepresented amongst the politicians, which is why I decided to take the plunge despite the disapproval of some members of the audience. I got into politics because I felt that it was wrong for us to leave the politics of our country to just two segments of society, the extremely rich Maharajas, Nawabs, Zamindars and so on, who commanded the feudal allegiance of some voters, and the extremely poor, the Marxists called the lumpen proletariat, who had nothing to gain and nothing to lose, and went into politics as a means of their own personal advancement in life. So people coming from next to nothing who become crorpatis have done so through politics, and that's also there. So if people like the educated middle class represented in this room want political leaders whom they don't have to make excuses for, but leaders they can be proud of, then we should have all kinds of people in politics. But equally, if some people say that we are best represented by some equally uneducated or illiterate person who speaks our language and speaks to us, and we vote for him, then he has a right to be there and they have a right to vote for him too. Ultimately, we all get the political leaders we deserve. Now, on your second question, it's too vast a topic, my dear, because we all know that no crystal ball really works very well, that 20 years is a long time. I would tell you what I would like to see. I cannot tell you that I will see it, but I would like to see an India in which everyone can be guaranteed a roof over their heads, a decent job, education for their children, access to health care in the event of illness, decent work for themselves, and the prospect of improving their lot in life on a daily basis. That is the dream and the fantasy one works for. Will India be like that in 20 years? All I can say is, I hope so. But we have all got to work there to get there, and that includes those of you who will be leaders of the country in 20 years' time. Unless you're asking in Malayalam.
പ്രിയ ഡോക്ടർ തരൂർ, അങ്ങ് പറഞ്ഞു കഴിഞ്ഞ ഈ അന്ധകാരത്തിന്റെ ബ്രിട്ടീഷ് റൂളിൽ ത്രൂ ഔട്ട് അവര് ഈ വിഭജനത്തിന്റെ വിത്തുകൾ ഇന്ത്യയിലുടനീളം പാകുകയായിരുന്നു. അത് എക്കണോമിക്കലായി, പൊളിറ്റിക്കലായി, കസ്റ്റമൈസ്, പലതരത്തിലുള്ള ആചാരങ്ങളായി എല്ലാം. എന്റെ ചോദ്യം ഇതാണ്, അങ്ങ് കരുതുന്നുണ്ടോ അന്ന് ബ്രിട്ടീഷുകാർ വിതച്ചിട്ടുള്ള വിഭജനത്തിന്റെ വിത്തുകൾ ഈ കണ്ടംപററി ഇന്ത്യയിലും തുടരുന്നുണ്ട് എന്ന്? അങ്ങനെ ഉണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ഏതു തരത്തിലാണ് അത് തുടരുന്നത്?
ആദ്യം പറയാനുള്ളത് പുസ്തകം വായിക്കൂ. ഇപ്പോൾ പുസ്തകം ഇംഗ്ലീഷിലുണ്ടല്ലോ, എല്ലാ ഡീറ്റെയിലും അതിൽ കാണാൻ സാധിക്കും. പക്ഷെ എന്തൊക്കെയാണ് തുറന്നത്? നമ്മൾക്ക് ബ്രിട്ടീഷുകാരും വിട്ടുപോയ ഇന്ത്യയാണ് നമ്മളുടെ ഇന്ത്യ. അതിൻ്റെ അർത്ഥം അവർ നമ്മൾക്ക് വേണ്ടി വെച്ച പല അന്യായങ്ങൾ നമ്മൾ മെല്ലെ പരിഹരിക്കാൻ സാധിച്ചിട്ടുള്ളൂ. ലാൻഡ് റിഫോം കേരളത്തിലുണ്ടായി, ഇന്ത്യയിലെ പല ഭാഗത്തിലുണ്ടായിട്ടില്ല. ആ ലാൻഡ് സെറ്റിൽമെൻറ്റ് ബ്രിട്ടീഷുകാർ ചെയ്ത പോലെ തന്നെ പലവിടെയും ഇപ്പോൾ കൂടി ഇരിക്കുന്നത്. പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് പാകിസ്ഥാനിലൊക്കെ ഇപ്പോൾ കൂടി ഫ്യൂഡൽ ലാൻഡ് ഹോൾഡിംഗ് സ്ട്രക്ചേഴ്സാണ് കണ്ടിന്യൂ ചെയ്തുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുന്നത്. അതുകൊണ്ട് അതൊക്കെ നോക്കുമ്പോൾ ബ്രിട്ടീഷുകാർ ചെയ്ത് ചെറുതുണ്ട്. രണ്ടാമത്തത്, അവർ 250 വർഷം മുമ്പ് തുടങ്ങിയ ചില കാര്യങ്ങൾ ജനങ്ങളെ പാവപ്പെട്ടവരാക്കി, അവർക്ക് ഭൂമിയില്ലാതെ വന്നു, തൊഴിലില്ലാതെ വന്നു. ഇതെല്ലാം തുടർന്നു എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ ഓഫ് കോഴ്സ് നമ്മൾക്ക് അതിനി മാറ്റാൻ വേണ്ടിയുള്ള ശ്രമത്തിലല്ലേ നമ്മൾ വികസനത്തെ കുറിച്ച് സംസാരിക്കുന്നത്. പക്ഷെ അത് ബ്രിട്ടീഷുകാർ നമ്മളെങ്ങനെ തന്നെ വിട്ടിട്ടാണ് അവർ പോയിരിക്കുന്നത്. അപ്പോൾ ഈ എക്കണോമിക് റിയാലിറ്റി ഓഫ് ഇന്ത്യ എന്ന് പറയണത് നമുക്ക് പല കാര്യങ്ങൾ മാറ്റാനുണ്ട്, പല കാര്യങ്ങൾ ശരിക്ക് അന്യായം തന്നെയാണ്. പക്ഷേ പണ്ടൊരു കഥയുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. ഒരാൾ പിന്നെ വണ്ടി പോയിട്ട് ഒരു കൃഷിക്കാരനോട് ചോദിക്കും, തിരുവനന്തപുരത്ത് പോകുന്ന വഴി ഏതാണെന്ന് ചോദിക്കും. അപ്പോൾ ആ കൃഷിക്കാരൻ പറയും, തിരുവനന്തപുരത്ത് പോകണമെങ്കിൽ ഇവിടുന്നല്ല തുടങ്ങേണ്ടത്. മനസ്സിലായില്ലേ? അപ്പോൾ അതുപോലെ തന്നെ നമ്മൾ നമ്മുടെ എക്കണോമിക് റിയാലിറ്റി നോക്കുമ്പോൾ നമുക്ക് 47 കണ്ട സ്ഥിതി എന്നല്ല നമുക്ക് തുടങ്ങണ്ടായിരുന്നു. നമ്മൾ അഥവാ ഒരു ക്ലീൻ സ്ലേറ്റിൽ തുടങ്ങണമെങ്കിൽ വേറെ ഒരു ഇന്ത്യ കെട്ടിയാൽ സാധിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടാവും. പക്ഷെ 1947 ബ്രിട്ടീഷുകാർ നമ്മൾക്ക് വെച്ച് പോയ ഇന്ത്യയെ നമുക്കുള്ളൂ. അതിനെ എടുത്തിട്ടാണ് നമ്മൾ മുന്നോട്ട് പോകാൻ ശ്രമിച്ചിരിക്കുന്നത്.
സാർ, ഒരു ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻ. സാർ, ശ്രീനാരായണ ഗുരു തന്നെ പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ട് നമുക്ക് സന്യാസം തന്നത് ബ്രിട്ടീഷുകാരാണെന്ന്. അതുപോലെ തന്നെ 1947 വിഭജന സമയത്ത് അംബേദ്കർ ആണെങ്കിലും ബ്രിട്ടീഷുകാരുടെ കൂടെ നിന്നാണ് ദളിതർക്ക് വേണ്ടി മാക്സിമം ആനുകൂല്യങ്ങൾ ഫൈറ്റ് ചെയ്ത് മേടിക്കുന്നത്. അപ്പൊ നമ്മുടെ കാസ്റ്റ് സിസ്റ്റത്തെ ഇല്ലാതാക്കാൻ ബ്രിട്ടീഷുകാർ സഹായിച്ചോ? ഒരു ചെറിയ ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻ കൂടി, കാരണം ഇത് താങ്കൾക്കായിരിക്കും ഏറ്റവും നന്നായിട്ട് ആൻസർ ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റുന്ന. 1947 ഇന്ത്യയുടെ പ്രധാനമന്ത്രിയായിരുന്ന നെഹ്റു സയന്റിഫിക് ടെമ്പർ എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ഒരു വേർഡ് നമുക്ക് സമ്മാനിച്ച ആളാണ്. പക്ഷെ ഇന്നത്തെ പലരും പറയുന്നത് ഇന്ത്യക്കാർ വിമാനം കണ്ടുപിടിച്ചു തുടങ്ങിയ കാര്യങ്ങളാണ് പറയുന്നത്. അപ്പൊ 47 2017 വരുമ്പോൾ ഇന്ത്യയുടെ ജനാധിപത്യം എന്തും വേണ്ടി വളർന്നു? ഈ രണ്ട് ക്വസ്റ്റ്യനാണ്.
ആദ്യത്തെ ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻ ആദ്യം പറയും എന്തായിരുന്നു? കാസ്റ്റ് സിസ്റ്റം. ശരി തന്നെ, താങ്കൾ പറഞ്ഞത് ശരിയാണ്. ഒരു വിധത്തിൽ ദളിത്മാരെ, പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് ഞാൻ ദളിത്മാരെ കുറിച്ച് മാത്രമേ പറയുന്നുള്ളൂ. ഭാരതത്തിന്റെ പല ഭാഗത്തിൽ ബ്രിട്ടീഷുകാരുടെ സ്കൂളിൽ പോയി അവരുടെ വിദ്യാഭ്യാസം പഠിച്ചിട്ടാണ് അവർക്ക് അവരുടെ സ്ഥിതിയെ മാറ്റാനുള്ള ധൈര്യം കിട്ടിയതും അതിൻ്റെ ഇൻ്റലക്ച്വൽ ടൂൾസ് കിട്ടിയതും അങ്ങനെയാണ്. പക്ഷേ അംബേദ്കറിൻ്റെ കഥ നോക്കുകയാണെങ്കിലോ ജ്യോതിബ ഫൂലെയുടെ കഥ നോക്കുകയാണെങ്കിലോ ഇതിലും ഇന്ത്യക്കാരുടെയും ഒരു കഥയുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. അംബേദ്കർ ആദ്യം പഠിച്ചത് ബ്രിട്ടീഷുകാർ സ്ഥാപിച്ച ഒരു സ്കൂൾ തന്നെ. പക്ഷെ അത് കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ട് അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ സ്കോളർഷിപ്പ് കൊടുത്തിട്ട് അദ്ദേഹത്തിന് വലുതാക്കിയതാണ് മഹാരാജാ ബറോഡ. അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ സ്കോളർഷിപ്പ് കൊണ്ടാണ് അംബേദ്കർ കൊളംബിയ യൂണിവേഴ്സിറ്റിയിൽ പോയിട്ട് ഡോക്ടർ ചെയ്തതും ഇംഗ്ലണ്ടിൽ പോയിട്ട് ലോ ചെയ്തതും. അപ്പോൾ ഇന്ത്യക്കാർ എല്ലാ ദളിത്മാരെയും പിന്നെ ഒപ്രസീവ് ആയിരുന്നു, ബ്രിട്ടീഷുകാരാണ് അവർ രക്ഷിച്ചതെന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ അത് ഒരു കുറച്ച് സിംപ്ലിസ്റ്റിക്കായി മാറി. പിന്നെ ഒരേ സമയത്തിൽ നമ്മൾ തിരുവനന്തപുരം എന്താ കണ്ടത്? മഹാത്മാ അയ്യങ്കാളി ആക്ച്വലി ഒരേ സമയമല്ല, ഫൂലെൻ്റെയും അംബേദ്കറിൻ്റെയും മുമ്പാണ്. അംബേദ്കർ ഓഫ് കോഴ്സ് കുറച്ച് വൈകിട്ട് ജനിച്ചത്. ഫൂലെ 1870 അദ്ദേഹത്തിന് പ്രധാനം. 1860 ആകുമ്പോഴേക്കും മഹാത്മാ അയ്യങ്കാളി ബ്രിട്ടീഷ് സ്കൂളിൽ പഠിക്കാതെ കേരളത്തിൽ ജനിച്ച് വളർന്ന ഒരാള് ദളിത്തിന്റെ അവകാശത്തിന് വേണ്ടിയിട്ട് അദ്ദേഹം നിന്നു, അദ്ദേഹം ജയിച്ചു. അപ്പോൾ ഇന്ത്യൻസ് ആർ കേപ്പബിൾ ഓഫ് റിഫോമിങ് ദംസെൽവ്സ് ഞാൻ പറയും. ഞാൻ സമ്മതിച്ചു ബ്രിട്ടീഷുകാരുടെ ഒരു എഫക്റ്റ് ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു, ഒരു കാറ്റലിറ്റിക് എഫക്റ്റ് ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. പക്ഷേ ബ്രിട്ടീഷുകാർ മാത്രമേ നമ്മളുടെ സൊസൈറ്റിയിലത്തെ ഓരോ അന്യായങ്ങളെ മാറ്റാൻ സാധിക്കൂ എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് എനിക്ക് കുറച്ച് ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടാണ്. രണ്ടാമത്തെ ചോദ്യമായിരുന്നു, സോറി കുറച്ച് ക്ഷീണിച്ചു പോയിട്ട് രാത്രി ഉറങ്ങിയിട്ടില്ല ഇവിടെ. എന്തായിരുന്നു രണ്ടാമത്തെ ചോദ്യം? അതെ, നമ്മുടെ സയന്റിഫിക് ടെമ്പറൊക്കെ പോയത് ശരി തന്നെ. ഈ സയന്റിഫിക് ടെമ്പറിൻ്റെ വിഷയം നെഹ്റുജി പറഞ്ഞതിലും കോൺസ്റ്റിറ്റ്യൂഷനിലും കൂടി എഴുതിയിട്ടുണ്ട്. That the state shall endeavor to promote a scientific temper amongst its people. അത് കോൺസ്റ്റിറ്റ്യൂഷൻ ഓഫ് ഇന്ത്യയിൽ എഴുതിയ വാചകമാണ്. പക്ഷേ ഒരേ സമയത്ത് പലവരും അത് കണ്ടിരിക്കുന്നത് ബ്രിട്ടീഷ് എഡ്യൂക്കേഷൻ്റെ മെൻറ്റാലിറ്റി മനസ്സിനൊപ്പം വന്നൊരു വിശ്വാസമാണെന്ന് പലരും കണ്ടിരിക്കുന്നത്. അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് അവർ നമ്മളുടെ ചരിത്രത്തിൽ ഉണ്ടായിരുന്ന നല്ല കാര്യങ്ങളെക്കുറിച്ച് നമ്മൾ അഭിമാനിക്കണം, നമ്മൾ അതിനെക്കുറിച്ച് വിലവെക്കണം, അതിനെക്കുറിച്ച് ജനങ്ങളോട് പറയണം എന്നൊരു വിശ്വാസം വന്നിരിക്കുന്നത്. അൺഫോർച്ചുനേറ്റ്ലി ഇപ്പോഴത്തെ അതിൽ ഞാൻ ഒരു തെറ്റ് കാണുന്നില്ല. നമ്മളുടെ പഴയ ഭാരതത്തിൽ പല നല്ല കാര്യങ്ങളും ഉണ്ടായിട്ടുണ്ട്. അതിന് നമ്മൾ സഫീഷ്യൻ്റ് പഠിക്കാത്തതും അതിനെക്കുറിച്ച് നമ്മൾക്ക് ആ പ്രൈഡ് തോന്നാത്തതും നമ്മുടെ നഷ്ടമാണ്. 2-3 ഉദാഹരണം തരികയാണെങ്കിൽ, കേരളത്തിൽ വന്ന ആര്യഭട്ട അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ ആസ്ട്രോണോമിക്കൽ കാൽക്കുലേഷൻസ് ഗലീലിയോ, കോപ്പർനിക്കസ്, കെപ്ലറിൻ്റെ 700-800 വർഷം മുമ്പ് അദ്ദേഹം അവരും കാറ്റ് ആക്യുറസിയോട് ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. ഇപ്പോൾ കൂടി ആർക്കും ഇത് അറിയുന്നില്ല, ചില ഇന്ത്യക്കാർക്ക് മാത്രമേ അറിയുന്നത്. അദ്ദേഹം എർത്തിൻ്റെ മാസ് കാൽക്കുലേറ്റ് ചെയ്തു, ഡിസ്റ്റൻസ് ഫ്രം ദി എർത്ത് ടു ദ സൺ കാൽക്കുലേറ്റ് ചെയ്തു, എർത്തിൻ്റെ ഏജ് കാൽക്കുലേറ്റ് ചെയ്തു. അദ്ദേഹം പറഞ്ഞ പല കാര്യങ്ങളും, ഇൻക്ലൂഡിങ് ദാറ്റ് ദി എർത്ത് റിവോൾവ്സ് അറൗണ്ട് ദ സൺ, ഇതെല്ലാം 7ാമത്തെ നൂറ്റാണ്ടത്തിൽ ആര്യഭട്ട് കണ്ടുപിടിക്കുന്നത് ലോകം മുഴുവൻ യൂറോപ്യൻ അസ്ട്രോണമേഴ്സിൻ്റെ വഴിക്ക് 800 വർഷം കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ട് കണ്ടുപിടിക്കുന്നു. അതുപോലെ തന്നെ ലോകത്തിലത്തെ ആദ്യത്തെ റെക്കോർഡഡ് സർജറി സുഷുപ്തയാണ്, ഇന്ത്യയാണ് ചെയ്തിരിക്കുന്നത്. അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ സർജിക്കൽ ഇൻസ്ട്രുമെൻറ്റ്സ് സർവൈവ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ട്, അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ പണ്ടുകാലത്തെ ടെക്സ്റ്റ് സർവൈവ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ നമുക്ക് ശരിക്കും അഭിമാനത്തോടെ പറയാം, ഇന്ത്യയാണ് സർജറി ഇൻവെൻറ്റ് ചെയ്ത് ലോകത്തിലത്തെ എല്ലാം വെച്ച് ആദ്യത്തെ പ്ലാസ്റ്റിക് സർജറി, റൈനോപ്ലാസ്റ്റി, മൂക്കിൻ്റെ സർജറി ഇന്ത്യയിലാണ് സംഭവിച്ചിരിക്കുക. അതിൻ്റെ റെക്കോർഡ് 1ാം നൂറ്റാണ്ട് മുതൽക്ക് നമുക്കുണ്ട്. അതെല്ലാം സത്യമാണ്, അഭിമാനത്തോട് പറയുകയും ചെയ്യണം. പക്ഷേ ഇവരിപ്പോൾ ആ ഹിസ്റ്റോറിക്കൽ ആൻഡ് സയൻറ്റിഫിക് ഫാക്ട്സ് മാത്രം നോക്കാതെ അവരുടെ ഫാൻറ്റസീസിൽ കടന്നു പോകുമ്പോൾ നമ്മളുടെ പണ്ട് കാലത്ത് ശരിക്കും സംഭവിച്ച കാര്യങ്ങളും കൂടി ഡിസ്കറേജഡായി മാറുന്നുണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ നമ്മുടെ പ്രധാനമന്ത്രിയും കൂടി പറയുന്നു, ഗണേശൻ്റെ തല കണ്ടാൽ നമുക്കറിയുമല്ലോ പണ്ട് കാലത്ത് നമുക്ക് പ്ലാസ്റ്റിക് സർജറി ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നുണ്ട്. ഇത് എന്തൊരു ബുദ്ധിയിലായാണ്? ലോകത്തിലത്തെ എല്ലാം വെച്ച് ചെറിയ ആനയുടെ തല, ലോകത്തിലത്തെ എല്ലാം വെച്ച് വലിയ മനുഷ്യൻ്റെ കഴുത്തിൽ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് തുന്നിക്കാൻ സാധിക്കും? ഒരു വഴിയുണ്ടോ? There is no human neck large enough to accommodate the smallest possible elephant head. It's a metaphor. പക്ഷെ അത് അദ്ദേഹത്തെ മനസ്സിലാക്കിയിട്ടില്ല. അപ്പം ഇങ്ങനെയൊക്കെ പറയുമ്പോൾ it discredits the whole reality of plastic surgery in India. അതുപോലെ തന്നെ there are genuine scientific accomplishments. ഇന്ത്യയാണ് സീറോ കണ്ടുപിടിച്ചത്, ഇന്ത്യയാണ് ഡെസിമൽ സിസ്റ്റം കണ്ടുപിടിച്ചത്. ഇപ്പോൾ നിങ്ങൾ എഴുതുന്ന സോ കോൾ അറബിക് ന്യൂമറൽസ്, ഈ അറബ്സ് ഇന്ത്യയിൽ നിന്ന് വന്ന് പഠിച്ചതാണ്, അവരെന്നെ സമ്മതിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. ആൽജബ്ര എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് അറബിക് വാക്കാണ്, പക്ഷെ ആൽജബ്ര ഇന്ത്യയിലാണ് ഇൻവെന്റ് ചെയ്തത്. ആ അൽ ഖ്വറസ്മി പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ട്, ഞാൻ ഇന്ത്യയിൽ നിന്ന് പഠിച്ച സാധനമാണ് ഞാൻ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് പ്രഖ്യാപിക്കണമെന്ന്. യൂറോപ്യൻസ് അറബ് എന്ന് പഠിച്ച കാരണം അവരതിൻ്റെ അറബിക്കിൻ്റെ പേര് കൊടുത്തു. പക്ഷെ ഇത് ശരിക്കും ഒക്കെ ഇന്ത്യ കണ്ടുപിടുത്തമാണ്. ഒരേ സമയത്ത് പുഷ്പക വിമാനം എന്നൊക്കെ പറഞ്ഞ് നടന്നാൽ ശരിക്കാൻ തോന്നും ഇന്റേണൽ കമ്പഷൻ എഞ്ചിൻ ആരാ ഉണ്ടാക്കിയത് ആ കാലത്ത്? എവിടെ അതിൻ്റെ തെളിവ്? അതോ ഇത് പറയണതെല്ലാം അവർ ബേസ് ചെയ്യുന്നത് ഒരു 1923 ഒരു നൊട്ടോറിയസ് ഫോർജറിയാണ്. ഇതൊരു പുരാണയാണെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ് നടക്കുന്നു. പക്ഷേ 1923 തന്നെ ഇത് ഫേക്ക് ആണെന്ന് ഡിസ്ക്രെഡിറ്റ് ചെയ്ത് എല്ലാവരും സ്ഥാപിച്ച ശേഷം 90 വർഷം കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ട് ഒരേ ഫോർജ് ടെക്സ്റ്റിനെ എടുത്തിട്ട് നമുക്ക് പുഷ്പക വിമാനം ഉണ്ടായെന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ ശരിക്കും പഠിപ്പും അറിവും വായനയുമുള്ളവർ പറയും ദിസ് ഇസ് stupid. അപ്പോൾ എൻ്റെ ഒരൊറ്റ ഉദ്ദേശമേ ഉള്ളൂ, ആ സയൻറ്റിഫിക് ടെമ്പർ നമ്മളുടെ എഡ്യൂക്കേഷൻ സിസ്റ്റമിൽ നല്ലപോലെ ചെയ്തു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ we should combine both respect for the real accomplishments of the past and a critical mind to be applied to the illusory and fantastical claims that are being made in the present. So we have an accurate understanding of what it is we must be proud of in our past and not say fanciful things that make us look ridiculous in the eyes of the world.
നമസ്കാരം സർ, ഞാൻ പ്രദീപ് പതേരി കാലിക്കറ്റ് നിന്ന് വരുന്നു.
അല്ല, നമ്മൾ വൈൻഡപ്പ് ചെയ്യാണ്. നമ്മൾ പിന്നെ
ഈ ചോദ്യം ഒന്ന് കംപ്ലീറ്റ് ആയിക്കോട്ടെ. It is going directly to the book itself. Sir, I congratulate you for the name that you give for the book. All of us know that Europeans start writing history of India, especially the Britishers. What they termed for the ancient Indian history as Hindu era, wherein they called medieval Indian history as Muslim era. If they follow the same criteria, they should term the modern Indian history as Christian era because British ruled. Is there any reference of this in your book? And I congratulate you for giving the name Era of Darkness for this British rule. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I have mentioned the British historiography that created the idea of these periods, which are very simplistic and misleading terms that serve the British interests in creating communal divisions not only in the present of those days, but even in the recollections of the past. So I've talked in the book about how a lot of communal identities were made much worse by the British. I've talked about how even the caste system as we know it today was entrenched by the British and forcing people into narrower silos whereas the old practices were much more fuzzy and much more cooperative. I've given a lot of references and details and footnotes in the book that explain where I'm basing these conclusions from. In fact, even the Shia-Sunni violence in Lucknow is a British creation. Until the British took over Lucknow from Wajid Ali Shah of Shatranj Ke Khiladi fame, the Muharram commemoration every year was jointly celebrated by the Hindus, the Muslims, and both kinds of Muslims, Shias, Sunnis, and Hindus, all jointly celebrated. When the British came, in their typical categorizing sort of way, they said, no, 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 we know that Muharram is a Shia thing, the Shias will be in charge of commemorating it. And so what was so far joint was left only to one community. Then immediately criticism came from the other community. Shias and Sunnis started copying with each other. Violence ensued. This is unfortunately the reality of how the British created divisions and fomented them through their own policies.
Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, we have to wind up here because he has to take 12 o'clock flight, midnight to Boston. So thank you very much. And tomorrow we have another wonderful speech by Dr. Vandana Shiva. In fact, Dr. Tharoor was telling me he would have liked to, be here to listen to Dr. Vandana Shiva. Please come tomorrow at 8 o'clock to listen to Vandana Shiva. Also, please visit our, bookstore. It will be open for next 10 days. So thank you very much. And please keep coming on all these days. Thank you.